Hell, it's about time.
Hello and welcome back, all my commanders, servers, and executors to StarCraft Lorecast, the podcast where we dive into the lore, stories, and both the interesting and fun facts about the StarCraft universe. I am your host, Jeremy, otherwise known as General Fire, and I hope you're ready to dive back into this favorite franchise of ours. So, today we'll still be continuing on our little arc here, going over the major factions of the StarCraft universe that have helped play the role in shaping the history and the, what is the word I'm looking for? Territory, landscape, that's what I mean. Landscape of the Ka'Prulu sector. Now, unlike my, when I spoke about the major races of the Ka'Prulu sector, where I went from each of the race that we kind of started with following the games. Unfortunately, I decided to kind of change that around a bit with these factions because I realized that trying to do some research on the Zerg itself was a little bit more difficult than expected, especially trying to pull from what's different between the Swarm as a faction and the Zerg as a species. But anyways, today we're going to touch on the first of the major Protoss factions that has made huge strides in shaping the Ka'Prulu sector and the Milky Way galaxy as a whole. And that's right, folks, is what you were guessing was the Protoss Empire and the Khalai that helped made it up. Then you win. So, the Protoss Empire was an interstellar theoretic directorial empire that was made up of the Protoss itself. Now, we don't know exactly when it formed, what year, give or take, but we do know when it fractured, which we'll touch on later on. But it is currently, as of 2511, I believe, from what is it? The Evolution book. It's currently defunct. It got defunct in the year 2500. So, the Protoss Empire, though, was an interstellar empire of Protoss, of course, throughout the Milky Way, reaching across the Ka'Prulu sector. It was effectively shattered during the Great War. So, I always like to say the Protoss, think of them kind of similar somewhat in regards to like the Eldar of 40k. It's a terrible, I don't like comparing them, but they are the closest thing I can think of right now in regards to what they are like. But the Empire was formed out of the ashes of the Eon of Strife, the mystic Kos developing a caste system through which Protoss society would function. The Judicator caste would be composed of leaders and statesmen, the Templar caste of warriors, and the Khalai caste of artisans, scientists, and builders alike. Those who refused to conform were banished from Ire, becoming known as the Dark Templar, who we'll touch on in a later episode. Over the course of a few hundred years, hundreds of worlds were incorporated into the Empire within the Protoss' corner of the galaxy. Prior to the arrival of humanity at the galactic fringe, the Empire's territory reached across the entirety of the Ka'Prulu sector. Under the dictates of the Dai'ul, the Empire had a policy of non-interference towards lesser races, who were unaware of the Protoss' existence. Now, don't know if you all remember, but I believe the only reason that they utilized the Dai'ul is because, if I remember correctly, so its origins are found in the coming of the Xel'Naga, and they especially started utilizing it after the Kalath intercession, which I believe is where the Protoss ended up kind of wiping out an entire species, if I remember correctly. Let me just look this up here real quick. Yep, the Kalathi, that species. But yeah, so that's what the Daul is. But continuing on, what species that were aware of the Protoss were fearful of attacking them? A fear that some Protoss attributed it to their kind's unparalleled psionic powers. When conflict with other species did break out, such as the Khalai intercession, Protoss technology would normally stand triumphant. During this time, the Protoss developed the Purifiers, a race of robotic Templar made to supplement their military ranks. But their rebellion against their creators would cause the Protoss Empire to seal them in the vessel Cybros, and they would not be seen again until the end war, basically. Their successes would lead the Protoss to consider themselves to be the most powerful species in the galaxy, even the newly arrived Terran powers in the Kapulu sector being a shadow of the Protoss's might. Prior to the Great War, the Empire was experiencing a period of growth, though the Protoss population was in decline. Protoss were passing away due to sheer age. The Empire would meet its end in the conflicts of the Great War, when the Zerg swarm would invade the capital world of Ire. Although the Protoss stood triumphant at the 11th hour, it was a hollow Pyrrhic victory. With the Zerg running rampant across their world and their military might decimated, the Protoss were effectively made refugees, fleeing to Shakuris for refuge amongst the Dark Templar. By 2502, this conglomeration of Khalai and Narazim had been officially reorganized into the Dalim. Now, that's everything we know currently about the Protoss Empire, if its history and whatnot. I'd love to see more, learn more about the Protoss during their age of their empire. Because who doesn't want to learn more about an ancient, mysterious race that was apparently the most powerful in the galaxy, that had a long history dating back thousands of years, most likely. But going along into their known territories, they had their capital world of Ire, the world of Bracken, Belshir, Dylar IV, Endion, Glacius, Giris, Kirador, Samaku, Swampus, Taurus IV, Vanos, and Zaku. Notable members would be Executors Adun, Artanis, Clolarion, Tassadar, Judicator Aldaris, Judicator Cortnal, and Praetor Phoenix. Now, the Protoss Empire would be led by the Conclave up until 2500, with its legislative branch being the Judicator Assembly. After their escape from Ire, their capital base would move from Ire to New Antioch on Shakuris, and that would be the capital of the Protoss Empire between 2500 and 2502. So, and the official date they would be dissolved would be between 2500 and 2502. Now, some interesting notes about the Protoss Empire. The StarCraft Beta material indicates that during development, the Protoss Empire, or at least its military, was organized along slightly different lines from the caste system depicted in the released version of the story. The distinctions used are as follows: Earth caste, which would be the ground forces such as Zealots; the Ether caste, which would be forces with psionic powers such as High Templars; Air caste, combining the aerospace forces; the Automata caste, which would be autonomous units; and the Judicatura caste, which would be the Judicator caste forces. So, actually going back on my statement, the Protoss you could technically see as a combination of both the Tau and the Eldar. Ancient species with mystical powers that believe they know everything and are quite long-lived, to be honest with you. And with a caste system trying to bring a sort of greater good philosophy into the galaxy and helping out species when they can, even though they have a thing of non-interference with them. Now, if you think that's all this episode would be about, I could understand. I did say this was going to be about the Protoss Empire, but we're going to talk about the faction that they would end up forming into, known as the Khalai, who is part of a combined faction that we'll talk about later on for the Protoss, the Dalim. Now, what is the Khalai? Well, it's technically the unified Protoss tribes of Ire, whose dedicated leader would be the Hierarchy, which is at this point in time currently Hierarch Artanis. Now, the Khalai, which are not to be confused with the Khalai caste, are Protoss who follow the Khala. That's what differentiates them from the Nerazim or the Dark Templar. They are alternatively referred to as Ire Protoss or Templar, though not to be confused with the Templar caste, as a mean of distinguishing them from other kindreds, i.e. Tal'Darim or the Dark Templar Nerazim. Now, how did they form? Well, the Khala brought the Protoss out of the Aeon of Strife and in time would lead to the foundation of the Protoss Empire. While the Dark Templar refused to submit to the Khala and were banished from Ire as a result, the Khalai would nevertheless remain united and at relative peace. But during the Brood War, after the fall of Ire, the Khalai, now refugees, would flee the planet en masse to Shakuras, the adopted homeworld of the Dark Templar. There, they would cooperate with the Dark Templar against the Zerg and their never-ending fight with them. Their arrival, though, would not be without conflict. A legion of Khalai would end up following Judicator Eldaris in a revolt against Matriarch Razagal, a revolt that would swiftly be put down when Dark Prelate Zeratul, Praetor Artanis, and Sarah Kerrigan would end up returning. In turn, the Khalai were the subject of much hate from the Fist of Ulrazaj, a Dark Templar extremist group seeking to remove the Khalai from Shakuras. In the aftermath of the Brood War, though, Hierarch Artanis would struggle to keep the Protoss as a unified people due to deep-rooted tensions between both the Khalai and the Dark Templar, which would drive them into a return of a sort of tribalism. While the Nerazim were welcoming of the Khalai at first, Khalai demands for resources would soon stir resentment from their hosts. By the year 2505, Khalai culture would be in a state of flux, at least in part due to the loss of their caste system. Moving on into the End War, the reclamation of Ire was the one common goal both Nerazim and Khalai would possess. So to this end, Hierarch Artanis would lead the Golden Armada in an effort to reclaim the Protoss homeworld of Ire. However, the invasion would be thrown into array with the revealed presence of the rogue Xel'Naga Amon, who would corrupt the Khala and possess all of the Khalai connected to it. A number of Khalai would escape Ire on the Spear of Adun, having severed their nerve appendages, including those on board the Spear of Adun already. During this conflict, Artanis would order the end of the Khalai's caste system. Now, what's the Spear of Adun? Well, it's an arc ship that is your main ship in the Legacy of the Void campaign, or the Protoss campaign of StarCraft 2. We'll get on to that. I'd love to speak more, and the Spear of Adun does deserve its own episode. So, by the end of the war, the remaining Khalai would be freed from Amon's corruption. They would return to Ire alongside the Nerazim, the Purifiers, and some Tal'Darim, working to forge a new unified Protoss society. Now, as we know, during Legacy of the Void, you have a lot of stuff that happens. The first invasion of Ire, which would end up being a failure, and most of the Khalai and the Golden Armada being corrupted by Amon. You would then have where Artanis would lead those of the Khalai and other forces of the Protoss in multiple different missions to ally with the Purifiers, ally with the Tal'Darim, end up getting the artifacts from the Terrans, and doing all that to eventually reclaim Ire. And then you would have the basically final bit of it, where the Khalai would help assist in taking down Amon officially by protecting Kerrigan while she was ending up becoming a Xel'Naga herself. Now the Khalai would do this as a part of the United Protoss faction, the Dalim, which is later discussion on down the line, which will probably delve more into the events of Legacy of Void within that episode over the Dalim. But, moving on, Future Imperfect. Even years after Amon's fall, reconstruction would prove to be a struggle. The Khalai would grasp for purpose without the Kala or caste system, many finding themselves completely isolated and lacking any purpose. Wanting to distract themselves from the horrors of the current era, Khalai art and culture would begin to look back to the golden age of expansion, which could be seen in Khalai designs. However, this would draw some offense from the Nerazim, who would see the changes the Khalai pushed on their design as an offense. Despite the tensions, efforts were made over time to heal the wounds between the Khalai and Nerazim. Now, we end up learning about all this through the multiplayer pack that lets you get the Golden Age Protoss skins for units and buildings, if I remember correctly. So, but everything else we know about the history of the Khalai is definitely tied in with the Dalim faction, or the Unified Protoss faction. We don't know more about them. Would love to learn more prior towards this. But moving on to their culture. The Kala was the defining trait of Khalai culture. With their highly advanced technology and potent psionic abilities, the Khalai have long considered themselves the most powerful species in the known galaxy. Khalai are more demonstrated than the Nerazim in regards to their display of emotions. However, their culture is more monolithic. Khalai place heavy emphasis on collectivism and conformity. The concept of family does not exist in Khalai culture in the same manner as Terrans or the Nerazim. The warrior Khalai will often call other members of their kindred brother, as a sign of familiarity and respect. In familial units, and the base concept of a family do exist among the Khalai caste. Some Kalani phrases are exclusive to the Khalai's vocabulary, while others that are also used by the Nerazim have a different meaning to the Khalai than their counterparts. Because of the emotional connection provided by the Kala, Khalai would find it difficult, though not impossible, to hate one another. All castes of the Khalai are taught to dominate their emotions, even in times of great stress, as when they made use of the Kala, emotional instability could cause the Kala to grow unruly. The caste system once ensured that a Khalai was fated to remain in the caste to which they were born into. With the end of the system, Artanis declared that a Khalai could aspire to whatever position they desired and be judged by their deeds rather than by their standings. However, many would fall back onto the ways they had grown up with in the wake of the caste system's dismantling. Prior to the Great War, Khalai under 300 years rarely had any significant political positions. Artanis, who was 262 years old during the Brood War, was considered young despite his powerful military position. Female Khalai would rarely attain positions of power. They are rare among the Templar caste and were never part of the Conclave. Prior to the loss of the Kala, the Khalai believed that the Fallen continued to live on within their psionic gestalt. After its dismantling, a mythology would form around the spirits of those fallen, returning to the stars and finding a wider purpose in the universe. If the Khalai have a weakness, it's their difficulty in accepting change. The tenets of the Kala formed a rigid path, and the Khalai were loath to deviate from it, in fear of losing all they have built. Since the disbandment of the Conclave and the formation of the hierarchy, some Khalai have accepted the Nerazim as their kin, but old hatreds still remain beneath the surface, and the Khalai predominantly possess blue eyes. There are two known Khalai religious principles, the Da'ul, or Great Stewardship, and the Kala, the Path of Ascension. Some additional info. The Khalai have referred to the seven winds within their culture. The Khalai serve as the sub-faction associated with Artanis in the StarCraft tabletop miniatures game. They are heavily based off of Artanis' army in co-op missions with a focus on mobile warping abilities. The Khalai faction starts with 1 hero slot, 3 core slots, and 2 elite slots. Exhausting their faction card will grant 1 psionic energy. Their unique units include the Praetor Guard, the Pylon, and of course Artanis himself. Their specific abilities to include the Pylon Warp-In. If there is no friendly Pylon on the battlefield, set a friendly Pylon unit anywhere on the ground level of the battlefield, more than 10 inches away from any enemy model. This round, the Pylon is not eligible to use its special abilities. And the ability Bound by the Kala. At the end of the active unit's activation, select one other friendly unit eligible to activate in the current phase, immediately activate that unit. So, And some interesting trivia. It has been commented that, from a development perspective, the Khalai are baseline Protoss, and are the branch people generally associated with the Protoss race as a whole. The Khalai logo is labeled as Templar in its corresponding artwork. However, as it differs from the StarCraft II Templar cast decal and a corresponding design document uses Templar as a synonym for the Khalai, this appears to be the Kindred's symbol. But that's everything we have on both the Protoss Empire and the Khalai itself. I would like to take this time to kind of dive into a bit of the Conclave itself, which was the ruling body of the Templar as a whole. Going over the caste system, I'll probably do at a later date, most likely. But the Conclave was a small group of elders that ruled over the Judicator Assembly. The Conclave were a group of elders chosen for their wisdom and their knowledge and orthodoxy in relation to the Khala. The Aura tribe controlled who presided within the Conclave as it maintained the power within the Judicator caste. In addition, the Aura commanded the Khalanri Praetor Guard, the personal guard and enforcement arm of the Conclave. Female members of the Conclave were a rarity later in the Protoss Empire, to the point where some among the other castes were unaware of the existence. However, female adjudicators did sit on Conclave. At least one preserver was always on hand at the Conclave during its existence. They knew many secrets, also known to the preservers, who could offer advice but could do little more than observe. Preservers were utterly forbidden from serving on the Conclave. In spite of this, respected preservers had the ear of the Conclave and were often able to shape policy and decisions with their advice. The Conclave convened at the Kar Shakal, or Great Form, also known as the Heart of the Conclave. Now, the history of the Conclave. The Conclave was formed during the second age of the Protoss Empire. Early on, the Conclave would forbid entry into the Xel'Naga caverns, where Kaz would rediscover the Protoss Ionic Link. The Conclave would also hide the discovery of a Xel'Naga ship from Protoss society, although it allowed extremely limited and controlled access to reverse engineer its technologies. The Conclave directed that all texts and artifacts from the Aeon of Strife be sealed away on the Xel'Naga archive world of Zakul upon taking power. The information was entrusted to a trio of preservers. At the advice of the Grand Preservers Rohana, Orlana, and Shantira, the Conclave would order the construction of 3 great arcships, the Spear of Adun, the Memory of Nazin, and the Pride of Altaris, in case a great calamity would befall the Protoss Empire. However, the preservers ascertained that as they were still in use, the Protoss would throw them against any and all threats to the Empire. And so the Grand Preservers would sway the Conclave to seal the arcships in stasis underneath Ire, with themselves and a contingent of warriors in them, only to be awoken in a time when the Conclave viewed the Empire was losing and on the brink of collapse. The Purifiers were built under direct order of the Conclave to be an ultimate fighting force at a time when Protoss scientists were making technological advancements in intelligent robotics and artificial intelligence. The program was originally kept in the shadow and unified by the belief that consciousness could be turned into data, thereby used to preserve the thought process and decision-making ability of a formerly living being. Studies proved that the replications were often 99.3% accurate to the Protoss subject the replication was patterned after. The Conclave would move to use this technology to build a force replicated from the greatest warriors in history. They did not, however, treat the Purifiers with the same respect afforded to regular Templar. Instead, in their eyes, the Purifiers were little more than slaves. Eventually, the Purifiers would choose to rebel, killing their masters. In return, the Conclave would determine that the Purifiers were too dangerous and would ban them. They were powered down and launched away in a command vessel known as Cybros to be reactivated only in the direst of circumstances. And then you'd have their issues with the Dark Templar, which the Conclave would keep the secret the existence of a group of rogue Protoss that had refused to submit to the Khala. Convinced that their aberrant influence might spread throughout Protoss society and destroy all that Koss had accomplished, they would order Executor Dune to eradicate them. When Ire was rocked by a series of violent psionic storms, the Conclave would be shocked that the Templar had not destroyed the rogues, but knew that it would be forced to publicly admit their existence if it punished a Dune for insubordination. The Conclave would decide to banish the rogues from Ire. This act would earn them the hatred of the Dark Templar itself. And following the Zerg invasion, when Executor Tashdar would bring a number of Zerg pros to Ire in 2499, the Conclave would refer to the Terrans as worthless and argued that if they had already been infested, they were to be purified. Upon hearing that Chasara had been infested, the Conclave would immediately order Tashdar to burn it. They then ordered Tashdar to investigate and purify the colony of Marsara and to destroy any planet in Terran space infested by the Zerg to quell their taint. The Conclave bade Tashdar to return to Ire after the fall of Chersonis. They had hoped to humiliate him for violating the orders and likely execute them. However, the call of the infestation of Sarah Kerrigan compelled him to only recall part of his fleet, taking the Gantrathor to Char. After the Zerg invasion of Ire in 2500, the Conclave dictated that the first priority was to strengthen their defenses. They would strip Tashdar of his rank and would appoint young Artanis as the new executor. They would reinforce the provinces of Antioch and Sion and would attempt an ill-fated attack on one of the Zerg's Cerebrates. The Conclave would become convinced that his stratagems were winning the war against the Zerg after the destruction of the Hive cluster near Sion, in spite of their defeat at Antioch and the fall of Praetor Phoenix. Turning their attention to personal matters, they would order Judicator Aldaris and Executor Artanis to find and arrest Tassadar and bring him to Ire to stand trial for treason. However, Artanis would violate the Conclave's orders and would instead opt to help Tassadar retrieve the Dark Prelate Saratol. By this action, the Conclave would condemn Artanis and the Templar that would follow him. The Conclave would brand Tassadar a traitor upon Aldaris' return to Ire, demanding his arrest and the execution of Saratol and his Conclave. However, in a brutal counterattack, Saratol, Artanis, Tassadar, the Dragoon-implanted Phoenix, and the Terran Jim Raynor would attack the Conclave's forces. In a fierce battle, the rebels destroyed the heart of the Conclave, but Tassadar, unable to handle Protoss slaughtering Protoss, would surrender and be taken into custody. They would place him in a stasis cell and arrange for his execution, when the cell would be attacked by Phoenix, Artanis, and Jim Raynor. The Conclave would warp in a contingent of forces to quell the situation, but they would find themselves surrounded due to the intervention of the Dark Prelate Saratol. The Conclave would witness as Saratol would assassinate two of the Overmind Cerebrates. They would then send Aldaris to admit that they had been in error in their persecution of Tassadar and the Dark Templar. Now, as we stated, the Conclave would end up being wiped out. And that would be by the Brute War. And the hierarchy, though, would be regarded as its successive body. Despite its destruction, though, the Conclave's military leaders are still present within Protoss forces and remain loyal to the Dalim. Some known members would be Cortana, and some interesting notes we have. The end of the Conclave differs between sources. The mission Eye of the Storm in StarCraft establishes that the Conclave still existed by the end of the Great War. StarCraft, the Dark Templar saga Twilight, however, claims that Tassadar regretfully slew all of the members to avoid being imprisoned by them at a time when his actions were desperately needed. Artanis' sacrifice, released after Twilight, depicts Tassadar's surrender, heavily implying that the original version of the Conclave's fate is the correct one. And in early drafts of the story of StarCraft, the Conclave was initially named the Enclave. In the beta, though, it was referred to as the Council. I might as well touch on the Conclave's, no, I won't touch on the hierarchy yet. Let's see. So that's what we know about with the Protoss Empire and the Khalai and the leaders of the Protoss Empire, the Conclave. Let's see, do I want to touch on this? I could touch on the call-up, but I kind of want to save that for a later video. or later episode, I guess. But basically, the Khalai is and the Protoss Empire are the original version of the Protoss that we get introduced to first within StarCraft universe as a whole. They're the ones who have the like gray skin, gray purple, not purple, the gray skin with the blue eyes and the golden armor. That's what we know of as the Khalai, and who were the Protoss Empire as a whole. It's who we deal with the most. It's who would utilize the Kala, which we'll touch on later, and who, Hierarch Artanis is part of it. You got a lot of good characters who are part of it that we end up learning about within StarCraft 2, StarCraft 1, all the extra media within it. But it's interesting to see this difference between the Khalai and then the future factions we'll go over, the Nerazim and the Tal'Darim especially. It's just interesting how they run kind of a, not exactly a religious fanatic group, but I would certainly say that their empire and their government is more run off of it's more of a theocracy than a dictatorship or an actual empire like we see with the Terran Dominion. But, and as I stated, a lot of people find similarities between the Protoss and the Khalai, the Protoss Empire and the Khalai, along with, they see those similarities between them and the Eldar from Warhammer 40k, and I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I can see it. The Protoss live pretty long. They are immensely powerful with their psionics, which the Eldar are the same with the Psyker abilities, or touching the warp over there. Which, hey, I'd love to. I'm planning on doing an episode about psionics, and if I can get in contact with some Warhammer 40k pal who knows a lot more than I do about 40k, I'd love to go over, like, hey, here's the differences between psionics and the powers of the warp and psychers and all that fun jazz. But that's everything we know about the Khalai Protoss so far. Maybe they'll get us something more. Maybe we'll learn something more about them. I mean, let's be honest here. If we can get a fighting game or something, like not exactly Dragon Age. Good lord, a hack and slash game in the vein of like God of War or something, where you play as a Templar caste warrior in the early Protoss Empire era. Oh, I think that would be fun. I think that would be super fun. But that's gonna be all today. It's gonna be a short video. I'm trying to make up for not getting one out last week for you guys. But I hope you all have enjoyed learning about the Protoss Empire and the Khalai as a whole. I hope you stick around while we continue on with our Protoss series. And always remember, Intaro Adun, my good friends. You have a good day.